About 4 years ago, the political landscape of the United States began to shift dramatically on the issues of border security and immigration. Heated debate and compelling arguments on both sides of the political spectrum had made it difficult for me to understand the real problem. There were more questions than answers. Why do people undertake the dangerous journey to cross any border? What is it to be a refugee? What do the Border Patrol agents experience? And what does the border really look like? And of course, there was only one way to find out the truth: seeing it myself. My journey began at the southeast tip of the United States and Mexico land border, in a city called Brownsville, Texas. There, a police officer told me the heartbreaking story of a mother who was threatened by the cartel to give up her 2-year-old daughter to sell for trafficking. She had to make the impossible decision between giving her away or floating her across the Rio Grande in the hopes of adoption. The story really shook me to the core, and as I listened, the impact that the border has on citizens, residents, immigrants, and federal agents began to unfold. I realized that there was an urgent need to document the escalating humanitarian crisis at the border, and thus was meant to be a short weekend trip to a mere segment of the US-Mexico border and back. Ended up turning into a multi-year photography project that has led me to 6 borders across 5 continents. Now, for you all to truly understand these borders, I'd like for you to meet some of the people that I encountered along the way and hear their stories. One of the world's most dangerous borders lies between North and South Korea, where a nuclear war could erupt at a moment's notice. Thousands of landmines are still active inside the demilitarized zone, which acts as a 160-mile-long, 2.5-mile-wide buffer between the two nations. At one point, I was nervous and even a little frightened to be standing just meters away from where a North Korean soldier was shot twice while defecting to the south just days earlier. My discussions with the Korean people and those directly affected by the Korean War led me to believe that peace is paramount to them, and so is the need for the unification of the Korean Peninsula. In stark contrast to the heavily fortified Korean DMZ, the Colombia-Peru border is largely unguarded and rich in nature. Meet the villagers who reside along the banks of this Amazon River border. The only means of transport between villages at the banks of the river is via boat. And in the evenings, the villagers gather on a small island in between the two countries for bouts of wrestling and swimming. And as the sun set over the Amazon River one evening, my sister and I had the opportunity to join them on the island for a fun game of soccer. Kids there don't own iPhones or play video games, but they do enjoy what most of us don't have the opportunity to: a swim with the dolphins and a dive into the Amazon whenever they please. And their lifestyle really made me rethink luxury. Meet the inhabitants of Al-Shuhada Street, a street that is now a ghost town in Hebron, Palestine. The uncanny emptiness of the place is, to say the least, extremely eerie. Al-Shuhada Street was once the busiest street in Hebron, but it was shut down by the Israeli government due to numerous terrorist attacks on the street that left many dead. Innocent Palestinian shopkeepers were displaced and lost their livelihoods for no fault of their own. Also in Hebron, I met an elderly Israeli woman whose father was stabbed to death by an Arab in an act of senseless murder. With tears in her eyes, she further recounted the massacre incident in which many Jews were killed. However, in times of tragedy and in moments of despair, there's always a ray of hope. And she also recounted the story of a Muslim friend who hid numerous Jewish refugees in his home to prevent them from being killed. Meet the Arabic-speaking Druze residents of Golan Heights at the Israel-Syria border. The 1967 Six-Day Israeli-Arab War brutally divided family members with a new border and military personnel. The residents told me about how they used to gather on a small hill nicknamed Shouting Hill, and use megaphones to communicate with their relatives on the other side, and use binoculars to see them from a distance. The war ended in 1967, but the collateral damage will continue to impact innocents for generations to come. What you see here are the preserved shells of rockets fired into Israel by Gazan militants over the years at the Israel-Gaza border. I was looking at the fields charred by protesters using incendiary kites when I heard a sudden burst that sounded like gunshots. While my mom urged me to get back into the car and take cover, a retired Israeli officer at the site who was confident in Israel's missile defense technology assured me that I was safer there than in my school in the US, referring to the then recent surge of school shootings. Later that day, I had the opportunity to dine with and hear from an NGO aid worker who detailed the humanitarian situation inside Gaza for me. She shared numerous stories of pain and suffering and provided valuable insight into the vital role that aid workers play in conflict zones around the world. Her work in Gaza is immeasurable, and our world is a much better place today because of volunteers like her. My journey led me to the Strait of Gibraltar, where the waters of the Atlantic Ocean and Mediterranean Sea meet. I explored the two Spanish cities of Ceuta and Melilla that lay on the African continent and marked the border between Spain and Morocco. African refugees fleeing domestic conflict often see the two enclaves as gateways into Europe, and it was tragic to see that many risked their lives trying to cross the heavily fortified fences and trenches at the border, all for a better living. Meet the United States Border Patrol agents, who serve in some of the most geographically isolated locations in our world. Their missions are often mentally and physically exhausting and dangerous, as the person they're about to apprehend could be a pregnant woman, a child, an innocent asylum seeker, a drug dealer, or a criminal. It is equally possible that they may bump into a dead body. It is a hard job, and it should come as no surprise that some agents pay the ultimate sacrifice protecting our borders. They deserve our respect. Meet the immigrants who stand in long immigration lines every day just to earn minimum wage across the border in the US. To them, it's simple math. It's $8 a day versus $8 an hour. Many spend days in the unrelenting heat removing weeds in farms. And I felt a lot of empathy towards them when I was there. Drug trafficking is another real problem at the US-Mexico border. I met a police officer in Nogales, Arizona, who told me that there, drugs fly on kites. Drugs are stitched inside dogs and sent through the fence. Drugs are hidden in vehicles that pass undetected through Border Patrol checkpoints. It's a real problem, and when I asked agents and residents at the border how to solve it, many of them had a similar answer. Stop the demand, and the supply will automatically stop. Stop the demand, and the supply will automatically stop. There's a community in Colombia that has actually put this into practice. Colombia's Comuna 13 neighborhood was once notorious for gang violence and all kinds of illegal drug activity. The hatred between neighborhoods was so intense that you could be killed for accidentally crossing the border into one other than your own. Recently, however, the residents accomplished the impressive feat of putting an end to gang violence and embracing peace and prosperity through determination and resilience. Now, we have all heard from the media and politicians, but I got a very different and unique perspective from someone who endured the dangerous US-Mexico border journey herself. I'd like for you to meet an immigrant who crossed the border decades ago. According to her, while some flee their home countries due to the atrocities of war or poverty, many others are manipulated into undertaking the arduous journey by cartels who only want to profit from their crossing. Many of these immigrants don't know what to expect along the way, are deprived of food and shelter, and are dropped off at the border with nowhere to go. She believes that education is the solution to this problem, and that needs to start in countries far beyond our own borders. Inspired by my journey, she voluntarily gave us a 4-hour tour of her town until midnight, taking us to places we wouldn't have otherwise dared to go. Along the way, she shared her story of how she crossed the border illegally at the time and struggled to make ends meet. She raised her son alone, who went on to serve in the US Army. She won my heart. And there are many such stories waiting to be told. Stories where the setting is dangerous border terrain. The plot has a real-life impact. The conflict and resolution seems endless, and the characters are people just like you and me. As I became more invested in my travels, I began to fear the unknown less and explore far beyond what I was originally comfortable with, leading me to people who taught me invaluable and life-changing lessons through their inspiring and their heartbreaking stories. I learned that diversity is not just about having people of different races, genders, ethnicities, backgrounds, and cultures on the team. It's also about understanding things in a different light. But first, the truth must be the guiding principle in everything that we do. This is how we maintain society and not fall prey to our divisions. Divisions that are often amplified by uninformed and baseless assertions. We divide ourselves because we disagree on how the problem should be solved. And in the ensuing chaos and debate, a great many perspectives are lost. If considering every perspective is what is necessary to find common ground, then it is our duty to the world and every one of its citizens to do so. Not because it's easy, but because it's right. Bill Gates once said, if our optimism doesn't address the problems that affect so many of our fellow human beings, then our optimism needs more empathy. If we have optimism without empathy, it doesn't matter how much we master the secrets of science. We're not really solving problems. We're just working on puzzles. No matter what tomorrow brings, or however hard or long the journey may seem, I'm optimistic that we can still strive to be the change that we want to see in the world. And at every step of this perpetual odyssey, the decisions that we make and the actions that we take will define the mark that we leave and our legacy. Thank you.